The German Shepherd froze in the middle of JFK Airport the second a flight attendant whispered the name Michael near the cargo gate. And for a few terrifying seconds, every person around the animal thought the dog was about to attack someone. The massive dog had just completed a 16-hour military transport flight from Iraq, and airport workers were already nervous because the animal had barely eaten during the trip, refused to sleep, and spent most of the flight pacing in circles inside his reinforced crate while making low trembling sounds that unsettled even experienced handlers. A red warning tag clipped to the kennel door read high stress response, and nobody wanted to be the first person to open the cage. 2 TSA officers stood nearby, while passengers slowly moved through terminal for completely unaware that something strange was happening only a few feet away from them. Then the dog suddenly pressed his nose against the metal bars and began scanning the crowd with frantic eyes, as if he recognized someone who wasn't there. "Easy, buddy, easy," muttered a nervous airport worker named Carla as she carefully unlocked the first latch. The dog's name was Shadow, and according to the paperwork attached to the crate, he had once lived near a military base outside Mosul before being rescued by an international animal organization. But there was one detail in the file that kept bothering everyone who read it. Under behavioral notes, someone had typed a sentence entirely in capital letters. "Do not say the name Michael unless necessary." Carla thought it sounded ridiculous at first, almost like some kind of joke, until she noticed what happened every time the name appeared in conversation. The dog would immediately stop moving and stare toward the nearest doorway like he expected someone to walk through it. "Who's Michael?" one baggage employee quietly asked while signing paperwork. The moment the question left his mouth, Shadow let out a deep cry, so human-sounding that several people nearby turned around in shock. A toddler waiting beside the terminal window began crying. One of the TSA officers instinctively reached toward his belt. The dog wasn't growling or baring his teeth. That was the unsettling part. He looked terrified. Shadow suddenly began clawing at the crate floor so violently that the entire kennel slid several inches across the concrete. Carla stepped backward, her pulse racing. "Something's wrong with him," another worker whispered. But the strangest thing wasn't the panic. It was where the dog kept looking. Not at the crowd. Not at the workers. Not at the terminal exits. Shadow stared directly toward the arrival doors leading from international customs, as if he was waiting for one specific person to appear. Outside, heavy rain hammered against the airport windows while delayed flight announcements echoed through the terminal speakers. Carla glanced back down at the paperwork and noticed another handwritten note hidden near the bottom of the page. "If reunited with subject, keep cameras ready. Emotional reaction expected." Before she could process what that meant, Shadow suddenly stopped moving completely. The trembling stopped. The whining stopped. The entire terminal seemed to go quiet around him. Then the dog slowly lifted his ears, staring toward the automatic glass doors at the far end of the hallway, just as a tall man in a dark jacket stepped inside, holding an old, faded photograph in his shaking hand. The man standing near the airport doors did not move at first because the second Shadow saw him. The dog made a sound so soft and broken that several workers nearby slowly lowered their voices without even realizing it. It was not barking. It was not excitement. It sounded more like relief mixed with disbelief, as if the animal had spent years waiting for something his own instincts had nearly stopped believing would ever happen again. Michael Turner remained frozen beside the glass entrance while rainwater dripped from the shoulders of his dark jacket onto the polished terminal floor. In his hand was the same worn photograph he had carried for nearly 4 years, a picture showing a younger version of himself kneeling beside a thin German shepherd under the blazing Iraqi sun. The edges of the photo had faded from being folded and unfolded too many times. Carla quietly glanced at the image, then back at the dog in the crate, and suddenly understood why the rescue organization had warned them about the name Michael. Shadow slowly approached the kennel door after Carla unlocked the final latch. But instead of charging forward like everyone feared, the dog stopped halfway out and lowered his body close to the ground. His tail did not wag. His ears remained pinned back. He simply stared at Michael with wide, uncertain eyes that looked almost afraid to recognize him. One of the airport employees whispered, "I do not think that dog believes this is real." Michael swallowed hard before crouching several feet away, careful not to rush closer. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice trembling from nerves and exhaustion. "It is me." The reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Shadow took one hesitant step forward, then another, before suddenly stopping again, as though something inside him no longer trusted happy endings. Carla later said that was the moment she realized this was not an ordinary reunion story. The dog looked emotionally exhausted. His ribs showed faintly beneath his fur, and dark circles surrounded his eyes from weeks of poor sleep during transport between shelters and military checkpoints. A veterinarian traveling with the rescue team quietly explained that Shadow had struggled ever since being removed from Iraq. He rarely played with other dogs. He ignored treats. Some nights, he paced for hours without lying down, especially whenever helicopters passed overhead near the temporary rescue facility outside Baghdad. But the strangest habit happened every evening at exactly 7:12 p.m. Shadow would walk to the front gate of the shelter and sit there silently facing the road for nearly 20 minutes before returning inside alone. Nobody understood why he chose that exact time. Nobody except Michael. He slowly pulled out his phone and showed Carla an old video recorded years earlier overseas. In the clip, a younger Shadow sat beside a dusty military truck while Michael laughed behind the camera. Then a digital clock appeared briefly on the dashboard before the recording ended. The timestamp read 7:12 p.m. Carla felt chills spread through her arms. "Every night?" she whispered. Michael nodded without taking his eyes off the dog. "That was the time I used to come back to base," he answered quietly. Shadow finally stepped out of the crate completely, but instead of running toward Michael, he walked past him slowly and stopped beside the airport window, facing the storm outside. The dog sat there silently watching the rain streak down the glass while crowds moved around him in confusion. For nearly a full minute, he did not react to anyone. Then Michael noticed something that made the color drain from his face. Hanging loosely around Shadow's neck was an old faded collar that nobody at the rescue center had ever been able to remove because the dog became distressed every time someone touched it. And attached to the metal ring was a tiny cracked blue tag with fresh scratch marks all over the surface, as if someone had recently tried very hard to erase whatever name used to be engraved there. Nobody noticed the behavior at first because the airport terminal was still crowded with delayed passengers rushing through the storm, but less than 10 minutes after stepping out of the crate, Shadow began doing something that slowly made everyone around him uncomfortable. The dog started circling the same narrow section of floor between the rain-covered windows and the international arrival doors with eerie precision, stopping every few seconds to sniff the air before continuing the exact same route again. At first, Michael thought Shadow was simply overwhelmed from the flight, but then he realized the pattern never changed. 12 slow steps forward. Pause near the trash can beside gate C9. Turn left. Walk back toward the window. Pause again. Repeat. The movements were so exact that Carla quietly counted them under her breath the third time the dog completed the loop. "He is measuring something," she whispered nervously. Shadow ignored every attempt to distract him. A rescue volunteer offered him bottled water. He did not even look at it. Another worker crouched down holding pieces of chicken from an airport cafe, but the dog brushed past without interest and continued pacing the same invisible path across the terminal floor. What unsettled Michael most was how focused Shadow seemed. His eyes never wandered randomly like a frightened animal. They tracked specific details around the room with intense concentration, especially the electronic arrival board hanging above customs. Every time the loudspeaker announced a new incoming international flight, Shadow abruptly stopped moving and stared toward the ceiling speakers until the message ended. Then the pacing resumed. Carla eventually approached Michael carefully. "Did he ever act like this before?" she asked quietly. Michael hesitated because the truth sounded strange even to him. "Only once," he admitted. "Right before mortar sirens used to go off near the base." Carla felt a chill move down her spine. She glanced instinctively around the terminal, as if expecting some hidden danger nobody else had noticed yet. But everything appeared normal except for the dog. Outside, the rain continued hammering against the airport windows while tired travelers dragged suitcases through puddles near the taxi area. Still, the atmosphere around Shadow kept growing heavier. The dog suddenly stopped pacing and walked directly toward a little girl sitting beside a charging station with her mother. Several people tensed immediately, expecting the exhausted German shepherd to become aggressive. Instead, Shadow gently nudged the child's pink backpack with his nose once before backing away. The girl looked confused. "Mommy, why is the dog scared?" she asked softly. Michael froze. The child had said exactly what nobody else wanted to admit out loud. Shadow did not look dangerous anymore. He looked terrified of something nobody else could see. Then the behavior escalated again. Without warning, the dog sprinted toward the massive terminal windows overlooking the runway and slammed both front paws against the glass hard enough to startle nearby passengers. TSA officers immediately moved forward while several people backed away in panic. But Shadow was not reacting to the crowd. He stared into the storm outside while releasing short, desperate whines that sounded almost urgent. Lightning flashed across the runway, briefly illuminating rows of grounded aircraft in the distance. Then the airport lights flickered once. Just once. Shadow instantly dropped flat against the floor. His entire body became rigid. Michael's face turned pale because he recognized the reaction immediately. The dog was behaving exactly like he used to during incoming attacks overseas. "Shadow," Michael whispered carefully while stepping closer. "Buddy, look at me." But the dog would not respond. Instead, Shadow slowly crawled backward away from the windows until his body pressed against the wall beneath the arrival board. His eyes locked onto one specific line of glowing text above the terminal gates. Carla followed his stare upward and felt her stomach tighten. The board displayed an incoming military charter flight from overseas scheduled to land in exactly 7 minutes. The tension inside Terminal 4 changed instantly the moment Shadow reacted to the military charter listed on the arrival board, because suddenly the exhausted dog was no longer being treated like a traumatized rescue animal. People started looking at him like a potential threat. One TSA officer quietly radioed for additional airport security, while another asked nearby families to move farther away from the customs area. Michael could feel the atmosphere shifting around them with every passing second. Shadow remained pressed tightly against the wall beneath the glowing flight information screen, trembling violently whenever the boarding announcement echoed through the speakers. His eyes never left the line displaying the overseas military arrival. "This is not normal behavior," one airport supervisor muttered while reviewing the rescue paperwork. "He should not be reacting this strongly to a flight schedule." Carla tried defending the dog, explaining the stress of international transport and possible military conditioning. But the situation worsened when Shadow suddenly released another deep cry the moment uniformed personnel began walking through the terminal corridor. Several travelers turned around in alarm. A young man filming on his phone whispered, "That dog looks dangerous." Michael immediately shook his head. "No, he is scared," he insisted. But the problem was that fear in a large German Shepherd looked almost identical to aggression to people who did not understand him. Shadow began pacing again. Only this time the pattern became more frantic and unpredictable. Instead of circling calmly like before, he kept stopping in front of random strangers wearing dark jackets or carrying duffel bags, sniffing them intensely before backing away with visible distress. One elderly passenger stumbled backward after Shadow suddenly blocked his path near the coffee stand. Another traveler complained loudly that the dog should not be loose inside an airport. The rescue volunteer accompanying Shadow quietly admitted something that made Carla's stomach sink even further. "He has not acted this unstable during the entire trip," she whispered. Not until he saw the military flight listed on the screen. The airport supervisor's expression hardened immediately. "Then we need to isolate him now before this escalates." Michael stepped forward. "Please do not separate him again," he pleaded. "He just got here." But his words barely mattered anymore, because Shadow chose that exact moment to do something that frightened everyone nearby. The dog suddenly rushed toward the arriving military corridor and positioned himself directly in front of the secured doorway leading from customs processing. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply planted himself there rigidly, staring at the sealed doors as if he expected someone dangerous to come through them at any second. Airport security moved quickly after that. 2 officers approached carefully while another instructed Michael to step aside. "Sir, we need you to give us space," one officer said firmly. Michael's chest tightened. "You do not understand," he answered. "He is trying to tell us something." But even Carla could tell how bad the situation looked now. Families were recording videos. Travelers whispered nervously. Shadow's behavior appeared less emotional and more unstable with every minute. Then another problem emerged. One of the officers scanning the rescue documentation noticed inconsistencies in the transport records from overseas. A section describing Shadow's previous handler history had been blacked out completely. Why would rescue paperwork hide military information? The officer asked suspiciously. Nobody had an answer. Michael felt cold panic rise inside him because he suddenly realized how this looked from the outside. A highly stressed military-trained dog arriving from Iraq, reacting aggressively to incoming flights, refusing commands, and fixating on secured airport entrances during heightened security conditions. The misunderstanding was becoming impossible to stop. Shadow lowered himself closer to the floor as more officers surrounded the area, but instead of resisting, the dog looked toward Michael with exhausted, desperate eyes that almost seemed confused by what was happening around him. That expression hurt Michael more than anything else because Shadow did not understand why people were suddenly afraid of him again. Carla noticed the same thing. He thinks he is in trouble, she whispered softly. Then the airport supervisor made the decision that caused Michael's face to go completely pale. Call animal control and airport quarantine, he ordered. Until we know what triggered this behavior, that dog is not leaving this terminal tonight. Michael watched helplessly as airport personnel slowly closed off the section around the customs corridor with portable security barriers, while Shadow remained lying silently in front of the restricted doorway. The exhausted German shepherd no longer paced or whimpered. That was what disturbed Carla the most. The dog looked completely focused now, almost as if he had made some final decision in his mind. Travelers continued filming from a distance while animal control officers prepared a transport carrier near the terminal entrance. One officer quietly discussed sedatives with the airport supervisor, and Michael felt sick hearing the conversation. Shadow lifted his head the moment the metal carrier wheels rolled across the floor, but instead of resisting or reacting aggressively, he slowly backed closer to the customs doors as though protecting something behind them. He is guarding the hallway, Carla murmured under her breath. Nobody else seemed to notice except her. The rescue volunteer shook her head nervously. That does not make sense, she whispered. There is nothing back there except arriving personnel. But Carla was no longer convinced the dog's behavior was random. Something about Shadow's reactions felt too specific, too targeted. He never barked at crowds. He never reacted to loud noises alone. Every strange behavior traced back to one thing only: the incoming military charter flight. While airport officers argued over paperwork nearby, Carla quietly walked toward the abandoned crate Shadow had arrived in earlier that evening. Rainwater from the storm had soaked part of the kennel floor during unloading, and several travel documents remained scattered near the back corner underneath a folded military blanket. Carla bent down to organize the papers before animal control removed everything for quarantine processing. That was when she noticed something strange hidden beneath the blanket lining. At first, she thought it was damage from transport, but after pulling the fabric aside carefully, she discovered dozens of tiny scratch marks carved into the plastic interior wall of the crate. The marks formed uneven vertical lines grouped carefully together in repeating sets. Carla stared at them for several seconds before realizing what they resembled. Counting marks. Someone standing nearby asked what she was looking at, but Carla did not answer immediately because the pattern suddenly reminded her of prison tally marks people used to track days. She counted slowly. 5 marks grouped together. Then another 5. Then another. The scratched rows covered nearly the entire inside wall of the kennel. Some were older and faded while others looked fresh. Carla's stomach tightened as she realized the marks could not have been made during a single flight. Shadow had been tracking time for much longer than anyone understood. Before she could say anything, another detail caught her attention. Near the bottom corner of the crate wall, hidden beneath the final row of scratch marks, someone had taped a tiny folded piece of paper using clear weatherproof medical tape. Carla carefully peeled it loose, confused about how nobody noticed it earlier. The paper was worn and creased from moisture, almost falling apart in her fingers. On the outside, written in faded black ink, were only 3 words. For Michael only. Carla looked up instinctively toward Michael, but before she could call him over, a loud burst of static erupted from the customs hallway radio system. Several airport employees turned sharply toward the secured doors as urgent voices suddenly echoed through the terminal speakers. Shadow reacted instantly. The exhausted dog jumped to his feet and began pulling backward away from the animal control officers for the first time all night. But he was not trying to escape. He was trying desperately to get closer to the military corridor again. One of the TSA officers frowned while listening to his earpiece. "Hold on," he said slowly. "There is a problem with the incoming charter manifest." Carla felt cold tension spread through her chest as Shadow stared directly at the sealed customs doors with growing panic. Then she looked back down at the hidden note shaking in her hand and quietly made a decision. Before they sedated that dog or removed him from the terminal, she needed to know what was written inside. Carla unfolded the damp piece of paper with shaking fingers while airport security continued arguing near the customs corridor, and the second she read the first sentence, the color drained completely from her face. The message was not written by rescue workers or military staff. It was written by Michael himself years earlier in Iraq. The faded handwriting was rushed and uneven as though it had been scribbled during an emergency. If Shadow ever reacts to incoming transport flights, do not pull him away from the arrivals area. Trust him. He can detect seizure episodes before humans can. Carla stared at the note in disbelief while reading the final line twice just to make sure she understood correctly. If he blocks someone's path, find the medic. At that exact moment, another burst of static exploded from the customs radio system, followed by shouting deep inside the restricted hallway. One of the TSA officers immediately pressed a hand to his earpiece while turning pale. "Medical team requested at customs now," he called out urgently. "Possible neurological emergency." Michael's eyes widened the instant he heard the words. Then suddenly everything made horrifying sense. Years earlier in Iraq, Shadow had not been trained for combat or patrol work. He had become attached to Michael after repeatedly alerting medics before several soldiers collapsed from severe stress-induced seizure episodes during long transport operations near the base. The dog reacted to tiny changes humans never noticed. Breathing patterns, scent changes, body tremors. During one overseas convoy, Shadow had reportedly begun clawing at a vehicle door nearly 15 minutes before a young medic lost consciousness behind the wheel from an undiagnosed neurological condition. After that incident, military personnel quietly started trusting the dog's instincts more than certain medical equipment. But nobody outside the unit ever officially documented it because Shadow was never meant to be there in the first place. Carla looked toward the customs corridor just as two airport paramedics suddenly burst through the secured doors pushing a wheelchair. Slumped inside was a pale, exhausted military medic in his early 20s whose body shook uncontrollably while another officer supported his head. Travelers gasped and stepped aside as the emergency team rushed across the terminal. And directly in their path stood Shadow. The German Shepherd did not bark or panic this time. Instead, the dog calmly walked forward and stopped beside the trembling medic before gently pressing his nose against the young man's hand. The medic's shaking immediately slowed. One paramedic froze mid-step while staring at the monitor attached to the patient's finger. "Wait," she whispered in confusion. "His heart rate is stabilizing." Michael felt tears burn behind his eyes because he had seen this before overseas countless times. Shadow always sensed the episodes before anyone else did. The pacing, the fixation on the military flight, the panic near the arrival board. The dog had never been reacting to danger from the passengers. He had been trying desperately to warn everyone that someone arriving on the charter flight was medically unstable. Carla slowly looked around the terminal at the same people who had spent the last hour fearing the exhausted animal. Nobody spoke anymore. Even the airport supervisor stood completely motionless staring at Shadow beside the wheelchair. The German Shepherd carefully rested his head against the medic's knee while the young man struggled weakly to stay conscious. Then something even more heartbreaking happened. The medic opened his eyes slightly, looked down at Shadow, and whispered in a trembling voice, "You came back for us." Michael lowered his face into his hands as the full weight of the misunderstanding crashed over everyone at once. The frightened animal they had nearly sedated, quarantined, and removed from the airport had spent the entire night trying to protect a complete stranger the only way he knew how. And as Carla slowly folded the hidden note back into her palm, she realized the most painful part of all. Shadow had not been afraid of the people around him. He had been afraid nobody would listen in time. The entire terminal seemed to move differently after the truth came out, because suddenly nobody looked at Shadow with fear anymore. They looked at him with the kind of stunned silence people have when they realize they almost punished someone for doing the right thing. The airport supervisor who had ordered quarantine stood frozen near the security barrier while replaying the past hour in his mind piece by piece. The pacing near the arrival board. The panic whenever the military flight announcement played. The way Shadow blocked the customs hallway instead of attacking anyone. Every strange behavior that had looked threatening before now carried a completely different meaning. Carla slowly crouched beside the exhausted German shepherd while paramedics continued treating the young medic nearby. For the first time all night, Shadow finally relaxed enough to lower his head onto the cold terminal floor. He looked drained beyond words. Not triumphant. Not excited. Just tired. Carla noticed his paws trembling slightly from exhaustion, and guilt hit her so hard she had to look away for a second. "We thought you were dangerous," she whispered. Softly. "You were trying to help somebody the whole time." Shadow slowly blinked at her voice, but did not move. Several nearby airport workers who had backed away from him earlier now stood quietly watching with ashamed expressions. One TSA officer removed the gloves he had put on during the security scare and knelt beside the dog carefully. "I almost called for sedation," he admitted under his breath. "This poor animal was begging us to listen." Michael remained near the customs hallway, unable to stop staring at Shadow. The memory of Iraq kept crashing back into him stronger with every passing minute. Long nights near temporary medical tents. Soldiers joking nervously whenever Shadow refused to leave someone's side. Medics learning to trust the dog's instincts before they trusted their own symptoms. Michael remembered one winter evening overseas when Shadow sat beside a young communications officer for nearly 2 hours refusing to move until medics finally discovered the man was suffering from severe neurological stress complications. The dog had saved lives before, but seeing him do it again after years apart nearly broke Michael emotionally. Then something unexpected happened inside the terminal. The little girl from earlier, the one with the pink backpack, quietly walked toward Shadow holding a small stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her mother looked nervous at first, but the child slowly sat on the floor a few feet away from the dog anyway. "He was not scary," she said softly while looking around at the adults nearby. "He was scared for somebody else." Nobody answered because the child was right. Shadow lifted his head slightly when she placed the stuffed rabbit beside him. For the first time since arriving at the airport, the German shepherd gave a weak, slow wag of his tail. Several people nearby immediately covered their mouths or turned away emotionally. Carla noticed even one of the hardened security officers wiping at his eyes while pretending to check his radio. The atmosphere inside Terminal 4 no longer felt tense. It felt heavy with regret. Michael finally walked over and sat beside Shadow on the floor without saying a word. The dog immediately leaned his body against him with exhausted trust, and Michael closed his eyes the second he felt the familiar weight beside him again. "You waited all this time," he whispered quietly, "and I still failed you tonight." Shadow responded by resting one paw gently on Michael's boot exactly the same way he used to years earlier overseas, whenever Michael blamed himself for something. That small gesture shattered whatever emotional control Michael still had left. Meanwhile, the airport supervisor slowly approached Carla, holding the quarantine paperwork in silence. He stared at the forms for several long seconds before tearing them completely in half. "No cages," he said firmly while looking at Shadow. "No sedation. No quarantine tonight." Then he turned toward the rescue volunteers and gave an order nobody in the terminal expected. "Find out where this dog is supposed to sleep," he said quietly. "Because after what he just did for us, we are getting him home safely no matter what it takes." By midnight, the storm outside JFK had finally begun to calm, but almost nobody from the earlier scene had left the terminal. Airport workers changed shifts, travelers missed connections, and yet people still quietly glanced toward the corner near the customs hallway where Shadow rested beside Michael under the soft yellow glow of the arrival screens. Something about the exhausted German shepherd had changed the atmosphere inside the building. The fear was gone now. In its place was a strange feeling of responsibility, as though everyone who witnessed the misunderstanding felt personally obligated to make things right for him. Carla was the first person to act on that feeling. Without saying much, she disappeared briefly into the employee service area and returned carrying several folded airport blankets normally reserved for stranded passengers during winter delays. Instead of placing them inside another crate or restricted holding room, she carefully arranged them into a soft corner beside the large terminal windows where Shadow could still see the runway lights outside. "No cages tonight," she said quietly. Other workers began helping without being asked. A janitor unplugged a loud floor cleaning machine nearby, so the noise would not startle the dog again. One cafe employee brought warm grilled chicken and plain rice from the closed kitchen after hearing Shadow had barely eaten during transport. Even the TSA officer who once prepared to sedate him returned carrying a stainless steel water bowl purchased from an airport gift shop. Nobody treated Shadow like equipment anymore. They treated him like someone who had carried too much stress for too long. The most emotional moment came unexpectedly from the young military medic Shadow had helped earlier. After receiving treatment and stabilizing under observation, the medic slowly walked back into the terminal wrapped in a gray airport sweatshirt with monitoring wires still visible beneath his collar. He looked weak and embarrassed by all the attention until he saw Shadow resting near the window. The dog immediately lifted his head but did not rush forward this time. Instead, Shadow simply watched the young man carefully, almost checking whether he was truly all right now. The medic slowly crouched beside him while the terminal around them fell quiet again. "You knew before I did," he whispered emotionally. "Nobody has ever noticed before it gets bad." Then, to the surprise of everyone nearby, the young medic removed the military patch from his own duffel bag and gently placed it beside Shadow's blankets like a medal of honor. Other people began following his example. A flight attendant left a small neck pillow near the dog's resting area. The little girl with the pink backpack carefully tucked her stuffed rabbit beside Shadow while whispering goodnight. Someone from airport operations quietly dimmed the harsh overhead lights in that section of the terminal so the area felt calmer and safer. Michael watched all of it silently with tears burning in his eyes because for the first time since Iraq, he saw Shadow surrounded by people who finally understood him instead of fearing him. But the moment that truly changed everything happened around 1:17 in the morning. Outside, the rain clouds finally parted enough for moonlight to reflect faintly across the wet runways beyond the glass windows. Shadow slowly stood up from the blankets and walked toward the giant terminal window overlooking the airfield. Everyone instinctively went quiet, afraid something might trigger his anxiety again. Instead, the German shepherd sat down peacefully and stared at the blinking runway lights in complete silence. Michael carefully stepped beside him, expecting tension or pacing to start again. But it never did. Shadow let out one long, slow breath, then gently rested the side of his body against Michael's leg without taking his eyes off the calm night outside. No trembling, no panic, no searching. Carla noticed it first and covered her mouth emotionally. After hours of fear, confusion, and desperate alertness, the dog had finally stopped scanning for danger. For the first time since arriving in America, Shadow looked like he believed he did not have to protect everyone alone anymore. 3 months later, travelers passing through Terminal 4 at JFK still occasionally asked airport employees about the framed photograph hanging near the international arrivals hallway. The image showed a tired German shepherd lying peacefully beside a rain-covered window while airport workers sat quietly around him long after midnight. Beneath the photograph was a small silver plaque installed by airport staff after the story spread across the terminal community. It did not mention fear, quarantine, or misunderstanding. It simply read, "He warned them before anyone else could." But the biggest change happened far away from the airport itself. Michael no longer lived alone in the small Texas house he had returned to after leaving overseas service years earlier. Every morning before sunrise, Shadow followed him onto the back porch carrying the same faded blue tag that once hung from his old collar. Michael never replaced it. He only cleaned it carefully and placed it beside Shadow's bed every night because the scratches across its surface no longer looked mysterious to him. They looked heartbreaking. They were marks left by a dog who had spent years trapped between memories and waiting. Some evenings Michael would catch Shadow sitting silently near the driveway around 7:12 p.m., the exact time he once waited at the rescue shelter overseas. But now the behavior was different. The dog no longer stared anxiously into the distance, searching for someone who might never return. Instead, he simply listened for the familiar sound of Michael's pickup truck turning into the driveway after work. And every single time the headlights appeared, Shadow stood calmly and walked to the front door before Michael even touched the handle. The young medic from the airport eventually visited Texas during recovery leave several weeks later. He brought a shadow box filled with military patches and a handwritten letter thanking the dog for saving his life. Shadow accepted the attention quietly, but what moved the medic most was noticing how differently the German Shepherd behaved now. During their first meeting at the airport, Shadow looked exhausted by responsibility, constantly scanning rooms and reacting to every sound around him. In Texas, the dog finally slept deeply enough to dream again. Sometimes his paws twitched softly while lying beside the living room fireplace, and for the first time in years he no longer woke up startled by distant thunder or passing helicopters. Carla visited once too during a layover through Dallas. She barely recognized the animal she had feared months earlier at JFK. Shadow greeted her by gently placing his head against her shoulder before leading her toward the backyard fence where Michael had built a shaded resting area overlooking an open field. "He likes sitting here at sunset," Michael explained quietly. Carla looked across the golden Texas horizon while Shadow rested peacefully beside them and realized something she would never forget. The dog had not needed hero worship. He had not needed applause or recognition. What healed him was finally being understood. Before leaving, Carla handed Michael a small envelope containing the hidden note she found taped inside Shadow's crate that stormy night at the airport. Michael unfolded it carefully at the kitchen table while Shadow rested nearby. On the back of the original warning message, written faintly in his own handwriting from years earlier, was a sentence he did not even remember writing. During those chaotic days overseas, if he ever stops searching the room, it means he finally feels safe. Michael looked up slowly after reading the words. Across the room, Shadow was asleep with his head resting beside the old blue tag and the little stuffed rabbit the child gave him at the airport months earlier. For the first time since Iraq, the dog was not watching the doors anymore. He trusted someone else to do that now. Sometimes the kindest souls are the ones who spend the longest time carrying fear for everyone else.